Let's talk about base building, player housing, or as it's known in the Dungeon Master's Guide, Strongholds. This conversation can get into the weeds pretty fast. When it comes to letting players build things, there's going to be a lot of home ruling. A lot of personal research and work put in by the DM to make that player's dream a reality. The dream of home ownership, or castle ownership, or airship ownership. There are some raw rules we're going to dive into, but first, a warning. Doing anything involving hirelings, reoccurring funds, and construction time is going to be a burden on you as the DM. The players will just expect it to all work out, and it's up to you to track and catalog and calendar date all the things that go into it. And even more distressing, base building is often the request of a single player at your table. If you make a campaign centered around building a stronghold, there will likely be players that are into it and those that simply do not care. A player might create a character whose whole deal is that they want a castle. We need to balance that with the player who wants to ride dragons and the player who wants to become a demigod someday. All three of those backstory and personal requests should have equal weight, but it's very easy for the DM to get caught up in stronghold maintenance, doing things around the base that only one player wanted. And like that dragon, like that demigodhood, you want to give it some time. You want to let them feel the quest and feel rewarded when they finally achieve that base they've been pursuing. But castle ownership is not cheap and it's not easy. So before you do all the research, rules as written, or house rules, consider just giving your players the property. After a successful campaign arc, a series of missions to acquire this building, just drop the castle in their laps. As we talked about in Season 2, Episode 1 Travel, the wilderness is trivialized by level 10. And same goes for living quarters. By level 10, players have enjoyed the inexperience, stayed with a lord or two, maybe even in the king's castle, and seen real decadence. They've also experienced spells that make camping easier, like the level 3 spell Tiny Hut, or the level 4 spell Private Sanctum. Maybe they've even enjoyed a level 7 spell Magnificent Mansion. Showcasing all these various housing options will give you an idea of what that player is actually looking for. And sometimes you can just stop along the way. Maybe they love that king's guest room so much they just move in, and that's enough. I've known a lot of players who at the onset of the campaign are all about having a big old feudalistic castle to manage. But as the game goes on, they realize that summoning your house wherever you are is much more convenient. In which case, there's nothing stopping you from just making an item. A stone you throw on the ground that turns into a full tower. A doorknob that when twisted in midair creates a door to another pocket dimension where these players hang out and live. A magical matchbox that when the match is lit and thrown at the ground creates a hearth and a house around it. That sort of dwelling is extremely easy to manage as DM, and it also holds all their stuff. You basically just keep a map, whether drawn or digital, that you whip out every time they go to sleep at night. The next step up from that might be that boat, that airship. Very much depends on the type of campaign you're running. And now you have to manage where that boat is staying, or if the players are willing to leave the boat without some sort of hireling upon it, but still way easier than managing the land. Your next tier up would be a gifted building with magical attendants. Ghosts, skeletons, arcane constructs, it doesn't really matter. The castle takes care of itself. It can be remote, it could be in a defensive location, it doesn't matter. Because every time they visit the castle, it will be well maintained and stocked by magical means. Beyond that, a castle managed by the town below it. That's full of NPCs, but we know where these people came from, we understand why they'd want to be in the castle's area for protection. They pay taxes, which the players never have to touch. The castle is just maintained, though it's a lot busier. But that top tier, because your players really want to get into it, would be that full, managed, and built from the ground up castle, which does come with a lot of fun activities like choosing where it's going to go. When you gift them the castle, naturally it'll be wherever you can best manage it, wherever you think they're going to spend a lot of time or frequently visit. But if they build it themselves, then they get to pore over your map. Think about what materials they're going to be using. Decide where the rooms are, what the rooms are, if there's any secret tunnels. But just like presenting a puzzle or a riddle to your players, somebody's going to take lead. Someone in your group of players is going to care more about the stronghold than others, and naturally, usually, the other players bow out and let the one who has the most opinions take lead. But luckily by level 10, you shouldn't be flying blind. You should have a pretty good idea to how your players work, how they micromanage each other, their materials, their expenses, and who's going to take lead here. Then your job just becomes about supplying the base builder fantasy while still elevating the other players who are less interested. The player who wants to hatch a dragon and ride a dragon should get as much game time as the Stronghold manager player. Big long warning, I know, but from experience I can tell you that the majority of players are perfectly satisfied and happy with a summonable dwelling that they can customize. But if you're really gung-ho about giving your players a base to build, let's talk rules as written. In Chapter 6 of the Dungeon Master's Guide, there is a table building a stronghold, which tells you the construction cost in gold pieces and the construction time in terms of days. These, of course, are completely made up and have very little basis in reality. A keep or small castle costs 50,000 gold pieces and takes 400 days to construct. In real-world history, castles cost as much as the lord or king could afford at the time. Taxes were collected twice a year. If there was a big population, there were more taxes, and a better, bigger castle could be built. The majority of what we would call defensive structures were moats and baileys, which were extremely cheap to build because they didn't require any skilled labor. The king owned the land, the people that lived on it came with the land, and he would hire or command them to dig a big old ditch. With that dirt and stone from the ditch, they would create a small hill in the center and place a building on top of it, usually made of wood. These were also known as hill forts, and there aren't a lot of them left because the wood didn't stick around. Ignoring Roman constructions, it wasn't until the 11th and 12th century that things started moving towards stone. That meant a dedicated workforce, and usually one master builder that the king really trusted. It also meant quarries, shipping, logistics, whereas our moat and bailey just required a forest nearby. By the 14th and 15th century, we're looking at castles that are becoming households. These have windows, large courtyards, things that aren't essential to warfare and defense. So when you see that building a stronghold table, and there upon it, outpost or fort, 15,000 gold pieces, 100 days, that's not terribly far from the truth, as long as it's made of wood. Keep or small castle at 50,000 gold pieces and 400 days, that's complete fantasy. Castles had a lot of starts and stops. In particular, in the winter, the mortar would freeze before they were able to get the bricks in place. Famously, the reason why the London Bridge was packed with houses and shops was because they had to rent out that space in order to afford finishing construction. With the starts and stops of income, taxes, and the weather, building a castle took about 10 years. Here our biggest investment is a palace or large castle at 500,000 gold pieces and just 1,200 days, or 3.5 years. That's a lot of game time all the same. And even with a time jump, you can understand why the creators decided to go with something a little less realistic. The table also includes the prices for things like abbeys, trading posts, noble estates with manors. There's even a little rule about the construction time changing. It says, work can continue while the character is away, but each day the character is away adds 3 days to the construction time. And then the section ends. Now there's an earlier table called maintenance costs in the same chapter 6, which goes over the cost per day of running a keep or castle, which is 100 gold pieces. A palace or large castle costs 400 gold pieces a day to manage. That includes the hiring of 200 skilled hirelings and 100 untrained hirelings. And that's it. That's all you're going to glean from the source book that is the Dungeon Master's Guide. You can see why people get into home ruling so fast. Does that time frame work for your players? Does the map even work for a stronghold? Do you have a quarry? Do you have a forest nearby? Where are the materials coming from? Where does the labor come from? Are the players collecting taxes? Do they have to contend with weather in winter? Is there a faction that wouldn't want the castle to be there? Would attack while it was under construction? This one basic idea of a stronghold can dominate an entire campaign just to make sense, which is why summonable buildings and airships are so popular. But if you do want to go that deep, and you want to go deeper, there's been a lot of people who have put effort into making working construction systems. The most popular home rule options for strongholds comes from a Redditor by the name of The Singular Anyone, who put together a nice little stronghold PDF that anyone can find online for free. This follows the basic rules of construction, but adds on expansions or custom rooms that can give your players benefits. So for instance, adding a dining hall at the cost of 2,500 gold pieces allows players to gain inspiration until their next short rest. Completely home-ruled stuff, but it's given everyone in the D&D community something to base their ideas on, and out of it, the pricing for these various expansions. Some of these are more powerful than others, or might break your game depending on your players. For instance, the Graveyard, which costs the same as the Dining Hall, allows players to cast necromancy spells at higher level. It also automatically fulfills any needs for corpses for the spells, which means you build a graveyard which is already full of corpses, or the corpses are self-replicating. You can't think about strongholds in too much detail. There's also still more home ruling you might have to do on top of this. For instance, your players might want to build a jail to house a villainous villain. That costs 2,500 gold pieces, as most things do on this list. But then they want to upgrade it so it has a magical zone of silence, because that evil spellcaster is going to be housed in there. There is no rules in 5th edition for making a spell permanent. Permanency was a part of 3rd edition and allowed players to spend their XP to make a spell last forever. They decided in 5th edition to not include these rules for a number of reasons. The developers have basically said, it's messy. As someone who lived through and played in 3rd edition, it was extremely taxing, but also overpowered. You would, as a spellcaster, slowly fall behind your companions, but as you reached higher level, you just had constant spells all over your person. It was very easy in that way to break the game, and the payment of XP wasn't a detriment as you climbed in levels. Ultimately, one of the big problems with strongholds is that they require a lot of upfront cash. Players have to have stockpiled huge amounts of gold to reach their goals. By the time the players have even stockpiled the necessary 15,000 gold pieces for a fortified tower, they're probably getting close to level 10 and money is losing its value anyway. But it's still important to get rid of their excess funds. And I find if you're not going to straight up give them the building and the people to work it, you can make them repair the structure. That 15,000 gold pieces becomes 7,500 gold pieces. As they watch and you describe that building taking shape, regaining its former glory and purpose, they become invested. You could also do something a bit more video gamey, influenced by the likes of Minecraft and Valheim. You could do foundation costs, or what it costs to just make an empty building. For each 5x5 square on your map, it costs 250 gold pieces to put a wood structure there. Or for each square of stone structure, it costs 750 gold pieces. Then players can spend money as they have it to upgrade their structure. Add more buildings, more space, and then purchase on top of that the type of room they'd like to go in there. They want to buy a bedroom, that's 1,000 gold pieces, on top of the foundation, which is whatever size they created with their funds. They want to build an alchemist lab, you build the foundation, the room first, and then for 2,500 gold pieces, we put the furnishings inside. And worth noting, you just let it work. We're not concerned about an expansion building using different stone than this one or looking bad attached to the bedroom. Just let it happen. This is all for the player's fun and imagination. Naturally, some Stronghold add-ons don't require a foundation or a roof over it, like a battle ring or a graveyard. In that case, it could be built at the price without requiring the foundation beforehand. As you can see, this all gets pretty messy and intense, but I hope this gave you some insight as to how you can execute on Strongholds should your players request them. If there's one thing you take away from this episode, do everything in your power to make this easy on you, the Dungeon Master. You've got enough to plan anyway. Thank you for listening to today's episode. You can find more about the show over at kylefergusson.com, 2 S's in Fergusson. Music was by Brian Griffith, and I will see you all next week with a fresh new episode on a fine foundation of DM Gibbs inspiration.